Germany is afraid of. Germany invented the automobile. They perfected engineering precision. They built the Autobahn specifically to prove their cars were untouchable. And then Japan showed up with 7 engines that made Stuttgart engineers question everything they thought they knew about performance. These aren't just fast engines. These are the ones that forced Porsche, BMW, and Mercedes to redesign their entire development philosophy. Let's get into it. Number 7. Nissan VR38DETT. The Nürburgring embarrassment. March 2008. Porsche's test facility adjacent to the Nürburgring Nordschleife. A 997 GT3 has just completed a flying lap. 7 minutes, 42 seconds. Fast enough to validate the chassis upgrades, fast enough to justify the price premium over the base 911. Fast enough until someone points at the timing screen, showing a lap that just finished 3 minutes earlier. 7 minutes, 29 seconds. 13 seconds faster. In a Nissan GT-R that costs half as much. The Porsche engineers don't believe it. They check the data, they review the telemetry, they calculate corner speeds and acceleration figures. And slowly, the realization settles in. Nissan has built a 3.8-liter twin-turbocharged V6 that's making Porsche's naturally aspirated flat 6 look inadequate in every measurable way. The VR38DETT officially made 480 horsepower when the R35 GT-R launched, but every independent dyno test showed 520-plus horsepower at the wheels. Nissan was sandbagging by 50 horsepower minimum. The twin IHI turbochargers, the plasma-sprayed cylinder bores, the individually hand-assembled engines built by master technicians. This wasn't just good engineering. This was Nissan building a competitor to the 911 Turbo and pricing it at base Carrera money. What terrified Germany wasn't just the lap time, it was the implication. Porsche had spent decades refining the 911 platform. They'd built an entire brand identity around Nürburgring superiority. And Nissan had shown up, first attempt, and gone 13 seconds faster in a car that cost $69,850 versus the GT3's $112,200. The aftermarket validated what Nissan had built. A simple ECU tune unlocked 600 horsepower. Upgraded turbos pushed 800 horsepower on stock internals. Built examples exceeded 1,500 horsepower while maintaining streetability. The VR38DETTs proved that Nissan had learned from the RB26DETT's legendary over-engineering and applied those lessons to an engine that would compete directly with Germany's best. Porsche's response came in 2012 with the 991 GT3. More power, better aerodynamics, faster lap times. But the development timeline had been accelerated. The urgency was new because Nissan had proven that Germany's performance monopoly was no longer guaranteed. The VR38DETT remains in production today, still hand-built, still making more power than Nissan admits, still proving that when Japan targets Germany directly, the results are uncomfortable for Stuttgart. Number 6. Toyota 2JZ-GTE, the engine Porsche couldn't ignore. This is the engine that made Porsche engineers pull apart Supras in secret, not officially, not as a corporate directive, but individual engineers buying used Supras, taking them to private facilities, and trying to understand how Toyota had built an engine that could make 700 horsepower on stock internals, while their $150,000 911 Turbos engine needed extensive modification to approach similar numbers. The 2JZ-GTE's 3.0-liter inline 6 made 276 horsepower officially, actually closer to 320 horsepower. But the real number that haunted German engineers was the one that kept appearing in American tuning magazines. 700. That's the horsepower level the completely stock bottom end could sustain without failure, not for dyno runs, for sustained track use, for daily driving, for abuse that would destroy most engines before they reached half that figure. The construction explained everything. Cast iron block with girdle-reinforced main bearing caps, forged crankshaft and connecting rods. Sequential twin turbochargers delivering linear power from 3,000 RPM to redline. But more importantly, the engineering philosophy. Toyota had built this engine expecting enthusiasts to modify it. They'd designed overhead into every component, specifically so the engine wouldn't be the limiting factor. That philosophy was the opposite of how Germany approached performance engines. Porsche built engines optimized for their intended application. Toyota built an engine optimized for applications Toyota never officially acknowledged. And when tuners discovered that overhead, when single turbo conversions started producing 600 horsepower reliably, when built engines crossed 1,500 horsepower, German manufacturers realized they'd been outthought. The cultural impact was worse than the technical achievement. The The 2JZ became the default engine swap for everything. Drifters dropped them in BMWs. Road racers stuffed them in vintage Porsches. The engine that Toyota sold in a $40,000 Grand Tourer became the foundation of motorsport builds that cost six figures. That versatility, that universal respect from builders worldwide, was something German manufacturers wanted desperately but couldn't replicate, because German engines were designed with specific applications and power levels in mind. The 2JZ was designed to survive whatever you threw at it, and that difference in philosophy created an engine that tuners trusted more than any German equivalent at any price point. Number 5. Honda K20A, the Porsche Cayman Killer. Engineers at Porsche Weissach had a problem in 2001. Honda had just released the Integra Type R with a 2.0-liter four-cylinder, making 220 horsepower, naturally aspirated. That's 110 horsepower per liter, from a front-wheel drive economy car platform. The problem wasn't the power figure. The problem was the delivery. The K20A featured iVTEC, the evolution of Honda's variable valve timing system. Below 6,000 RPM, civilized and tractable. Above 6,000, a screaming surge to 8,400 RPM that felt more linear and controlled than any German naturally aspirated four-cylinder. Porsche was developing the Cayman at the time, a mid-engine sports car designed to sit below the 911 in performance and price. The base engine would be a 2.7-liter flat-six, making 245 horsepower, only 25 more horsepower than Honda's four-cylinder, from 35% more displacement. The specific output comparison was embarrassing, but the real concern was the driving experience. The K20A rewarded high RPM, driving in a way that felt more engaging than the Porsche's entry-level engines. It forced drivers to work for the power, to plan their shifts, to keep the engine singing. That engagement was supposed to be Porsche's competitive advantage. Honda had democratized it in a $24,000 Civic. The aftermarket response validated Honda's engineering. Bolt-on modifications pushed the K20A past 240 horsepower, naturally aspirated. Forced induction, builds exceeded 500 horsepower on stock internals. The engine that powered a practical hatchback could be built to embarrass Porsche's mid-range offerings at a fraction of the cost. Porsche's response was the Cayman R in 2011. More power, less weight, sharper handling. But the development had been influenced by what Honda proved. That naturally aspirated four-cylinders could deliver Porsche-level engagement if the engineering was good enough, and Honda's engineering was very good. Number 4. Mazda 13B-REW, the rotary that shouldn't work. Rotary engines violate everything German engineering stands for. They're inefficient, they drink fuel, they wear apex seals, they make no sense from a rational cost-benefit analysis. And yet, the 13B-REW that powered the FD-RX-7 made Mercedes and BMW engineers deeply uncomfortable, because this 1.3-liter twin-rotor engine produced 255 horsepower officially. Closer to 280 actually. From a package so compact and light, it enabled handling dynamics that conventional engines couldn't approach. The German concern wasn't that rotaries were better. They demonstrably weren't by most metrics. The concern was that Mazda had made the rotary work well enough that it created a driving experience German manufacturers couldn't replicate with conventional architecture. The 13BREW's 50-50 weight distribution, its low center of gravity, its immediate throttle response, these characteristics came from the rotary's compact size and unique power delivery. The sequential twin-turbo setup provided boost across the entire RPM range without the lag that plagued conventional turbo engines of the era. And the sound, the rising mechanical scream to 8,000 RPM, created an emotional connection that German efficiency couldn't engineer. When modified, the 13BREW became genuinely threatening. Single-turbo conversions produced 400-plus horsepower in a car weighing 2,800 pounds. That power-to-weight ratio approached Porsche 911 turbo territory in a chassis that cost one-third as much. Built engines exceeded 600 horsepower. Some extreme examples pushed 1,000 horsepower. The rotary's fundamental inefficiency meant Mazda eventually abandoned it. German engineering pragmatism had won. But for the FD-RX-7's production run from 1992 to 2002, Mazda had proven that unconventional engineering could create experiences that conventional wisdom said were impossible. And that proof made German manufacturers question assumptions they'd held for decades. Number 3. Nissan RB26DETT, the engine that changed racing rules. If you're starting to see a pattern, Japanese engines that force German manufacturers to respond, Hit that subscribe button, because the top 3 made Germany change how they approach performance entirely. The RB26DETT didn't just beat German cars, it beat them so thoroughly that racing organizations had to rewrite regulations specifically to slow it down. That's not competition. That's dominance so complete that the sport itself became the problem. Nissan built the RB26DETT for Group A touring car racing. The 2.6-liter twin-turbocharged inline-6 made 276 horsepower officially, actually closer to 330 in reality. But in race trim, with minimal modifications allowed under Group A rules, it made 500-plus horsepower while maintaining reliability that German teams couldn't match. The Australian Touring Car Championship results weren't close. 29 consecutive victories from 1990 to 1992. BMW, Mercedes, and Holden couldn't compete. They lobbied for rule changes, weight penalties, turbo restrictors, boost limits. Nothing worked. The RB26DETT just kept winning. The construction explained everything. Steel billet crankshaft, forged pistons and connecting rods, individual throttle bodies, plasma-sprayed cylinder bores. Nissan had built this engine to survive racing abuse that would destroy conventional engines. And because Group A required manufacturers to sell road-going versions, regular customers got essentially a race engine with a warranty. The Atiza all-wheel drive system managed power delivery with electronic sophistication that 1989 shouldn't have contained. On track, the R32 GTR didn't just have more power. It put that power down more effectively than rear-wheel drive German rivals. Corner exit traction was a cheat code that BMW and Mercedes couldn't solve with conventional engineering. The aftermarket that followed proved Nissan's over-engineering was deliberate. Stock internals handled 450 horsepower. Single turbo conversions produced 600 horsepower reliably. Built examples crossed 1,500 horsepower. The most extreme drag racing applications pushed past 2,500 horsepower on architecture Nissan designed in the mid-1980s. But the real impact was philosophical. The RB26DETT forced German manufacturers to acknowledge that electronic all-wheel drive systems could enhance performance rather than just providing all-weather capability. That turbocharging could be reliable rather than exotic. That Japanese manufacturers understood racing homologation rules better than Germany did. The R34 GTR's values today, clean examples exceeding $300,000, validate what the RB26DETT represented. Not just a great engine, but an engine so good it changed what performance cars were allowed to be. Number 2. Honda. B16A, the VTEC revolution. Germany ignored. Germany dismissed VTEC as a gimmick when Honda introduced it in 1989. Variable valve timing seemed like complexity without purpose. Why add solenoids and switching mechanisms when you could just design better cam profiles? Then the dyno sheets arrived. The B16A was making 158 horsepower from 1.6 liters naturally aspirated. That's 98.75 horsepower per liter in 1989, with emissions equipment on pump gas. BMW's naturally aspirated 4 cylinders at the time were making maybe 75 horsepower per liter. Mercedes was similar. Porsche wasn't even building 4 cylinders. And here was Honda extracting nearly 100 horsepower per liter from an engine that drove perfectly normally in traffic. The VTEC system's genius was the compromise it eliminated. Below 5,800 RPM, the B16A ran on conservative cam profiles optimized for low-end torque and efficiency. At 5,800 RPM, a solenoid locked the rocker arms to aggressive high-lift cam lobes. The engine's personality changed instantly. Power surged, the exhaust note sharpened, and drivers got peak power at peak RPM without sacrificing daily drivability. German engineers had been telling customers for decades that you had to choose, streetable or powerful, efficient or fast, tractable or thrilling. Honda proved that was engineering laziness masquerading as physics. VTEC dissolved the compromise completely. The B16A's 8,000 RPM redline was higher than any German production 4-cylinder. The throttle response was immediate in a way that larger displacement engines couldn't match. And the sound, that rising metallic scream as VTEC engaged and the tachometer climbed, created an addictive experience that made power figures almost secondary. What terrified Germany was the implication for their entire product strategy. BMW built the M3 with inline-6 engines because 4 cylinders supposedly couldn't deliver M car performance. Honda had just proven that assumption wrong. Mercedes positioned their 4 cylinders as economy engines because performance required 6 or 8 cylinders. The B16A made that positioning look outdated. The aftermarket validated Honda's engineering margins. Stock internals handled 200 plus horsepower, naturally aspirated with aggressive cams and tuning. Forced induction builds exceeded 400 horsepower. The engine that powered a $15,000 Civic could be built to challenge German sports cars, costing 5 times as much. Germany's response took years. BMW eventually developed Valvetronic. Mercedes introduced their own variable valve timing systems. But Honda had gotten there first, executed it better, and proven it in millions of reliable street cars before German manufacturers even started development. The B16A changed how the world thought about four-cylinder performance, and Germany never quite caught up. Number 1. Toyota 1LR-GUE, the Lexus LF, an engine that embarrassed supercars. December 2009, a private test session at the Nürburgring, a Lexus LFA has just completed a flying lap. 7 minutes, 14 seconds. Faster than the Porsche Carrera GT, faster than the Ferrari Enzo, competitive with the Lamborghini Murcielago, from a manufacturer that supposedly didn't know how to build supercars. The German automotive press initially dismissed it. Lexus was a luxury brand, Toyota's premium division. They built quiet sedans, not track weapons. The LFA had to be a publicity stunt, expensive vaporware that would never reach production. Then people heard the engine. The 1LR-GUE is a 4.8-liter V10 making 552 horsepower at 8,700 RPM. Redline at 9,000 RPM. But those numbers don't capture what makes this engine significant. The sound it produces at full throttle is the single greatest exhaust note ever created by any production car. Period. Better than any Ferrari, better than any Porsche, better than any Lamborghini. That's not opinion. That's the consensus of every automotive journalist who's driven the LFA. The sound is so good that Lexus had to engineer the exhaust specifically to not muffle it. The intake routing was designed to feed sound into the cabin. Even the tachometer was digital because analog needles couldn't move fast enough to track the RPM climb. But the sound was just the emotional hook. The engineering underneath was what made German manufacturers genuinely nervous. Toyota and Yamaha co-developed this V10 specifically for the LFA. They didn't modify an existing engine. They didn't use corporate parts bin components. They started from scratch with one goal: build the best naturally aspirated V10 possible, regardless of cost or compromise. The result was an engine with titanium valves and connecting rods, forged aluminum pistons, dry sump lubrication, individual throttle bodies feeding each cylinder, every component optimized for high RPM performance and oral quality. The engine alone cost approximately $100,000 to manufacture, for a car Toyota would sell at a loss to prove they could build a supercar. The throttle response was instantaneous in a way that defied the engine's size and cylinder count. Floor the throttle at 3,000 RPM, and the engine accelerated to 9,000 RPM so quickly it felt turbocharged. That responsiveness came from lightweight internals and obsessive balancing. The engine weighed just 360 pounds, despite the exotic materials and 4.8-liter displacement. German manufacturers had dominated the supercar V10 segment. The Porsche Carrera GT's 5.7-liter made 605 horsepower. The BMW M5's 5.0-liter made 500 horsepower. The Audi R8's 5.2-liter made 525 horsepower. All excellent engines built by manufacturers with decades of high-performance V10 experience. And then Toyota, with zero V10 production history, built one that sounded better than all of them. That was the humiliation. Not just matching German engineering, but exceeding it in the one area, exhaust sound, that's supposed to be purely subjective. Except the LFA's sound wasn't subjective. It was objectively, measurably, demonstrably superior. Only 500 LFAs were built between 2010 and 2012. Production cost per unit exceeded $400,000. Toyota sold them for $375,000, taking a loss on every car. They didn't care. The LFA wasn't about profit. It was about proving Toyota could build a supercar that competed with Germany's best. Clean LFAs today sell for $800,000 to over $1 million. That appreciation validates what Toyota built. Not just a great engine, but a statement that Japanese engineering could compete in Germany's most prestigious segment and win on the criteria that mattered most to enthusiasts. The 1LR-GUE represents the ultimate expression of Japanese engine development. No compromises, no cost targets, no corporate parts sharing. Just pure engineering excellence focused on creating an experience that German manufacturers couldn't replicate. That's why it sits at number 1. Because every other engine on this list beat Germany through efficiency, through over-engineering, through clever technology. The 1LR-GUE beat Germany at their own game, building an exotic naturally aspirated engine that sounded like angels screaming and performed like physics was optional. Germany invented the supercar. Japan built one better. What this really means. Here's the pattern these 7 engines reveal. Germany built performance culture around precision engineering and incremental refinement. They developed technologies thoroughly, tested them extensively, and implemented them conservatively. That approach produced genuinely excellent engines. Nobody should pretend otherwise. But it also produced an industry that became comfortable. That assumed their engineering advantage was permanent. That viewed Japanese manufacturers as competent but not threatening at the highest levels of performance. Japan approached the challenge differently. What happens if we build a V6 that embarrasses naturally aspirated flat sixes at the Nürburgring? What happens if we design an inline 6 so overbuilt it can handle double its rated horsepower on stock internals? What happens if we develop a 4-cylinder with variable valve timing that extracts nearly 100 horsepower per liter, naturally aspirated? What happens if we build a V10 that sounds better than anything Ferrari or Lamborghini has ever produced? What happens, it turns out, is that you create engines that force Germany to respond, not with dismissive press releases, not with confident statements about their superior engineering, but with accelerated development timelines, increased performance targets, and a recognition that Japanese manufacturers aren't just competing, they're winning. The VR38DETT forced Porsche to take the GTR seriously as a 911 competitor. The 2JZ GTE became the engine German tuners swapped into BMWs and Porsches. The K20A proved 4 cylinders could deliver engagement Porsche charged premium prices for. The 13B-REW showed unconventional engineering could create experiences conventional wisdom said were impossible. The RB26DETT dominated racing so completely that the rules themselves had to change. The B16A dissolved the compromise between drivability and performance that Germany had been selling for decades. And the 1LR-GUE proved Toyota could build a supercar engine that embarrassed manufacturers with 50 years of exotic V10 experience. These weren't flukes. These weren't lucky developments that accidentally succeeded. These were deliberate engineering achievements by manufacturers who refused to accept that Germany owned the high-performance segment. Germany has responded. The current 911 GT3's 4.0 liter flat 6 makes 502 horsepower naturally aspirated. The BMW M3's twin-turbo inline 6 produces 503 horsepower. Mercedes-AMG's turbocharged 4-cylinder in the A45S extracts 416 horsepower from 2.0 liters. These are remarkable engines built by engineers who learned from the years when Japan was rewriting the rules. The competition made everyone better. That's what real competition does. But there was a window when Japan wasn't just competing with Germany. They were operating in a different dimension, building engines with precision and willingness to over-engineer that accountants should have stopped and somehow didn't. That window produced 7 engines that Germany was genuinely afraid of. The lap times don't lie, the dyno sheets don't lie, and the sound of an LFA at 9,000 RPM definitely doesn't lie. Japan built something real, something that lasted, something that forced Germany to acknowledge that their engineering superiority was no longer guaranteed. Some engines don't need German pedigree to be great. Sometimes the most threatening thing on the Autobahn is the one that was never supposed to compete. Catch you in the next one.